So next, we have our amazing keynote speaker for the day, Mari Cohen. Welcome, Mari. Mari is the senior politics editor at Jewish Currents and an award-winning reporter on American Jewish politics, Palestine, the criminal legal system, and also she edits and coordinates the magazine's work with incarcerated writers, which is a practice that she piloted soon after joining the staff in 2020. So thank you so much, Mari. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Is this good? Do I need to move it? Okay, cool. It's like short people problems every time. Okay. I want to thank everyone so much for being here and for staying all the way to the end of these fruitful days. I really appreciate Look to Justice and Haymarket for bringing us all together, and all the other sponsoring organizations, and the inimitable Christopher Blackwell for inviting me to participate. I've been so inspired by 2 days of illuminating panels with so many people experienced in doing this work. And so I'm just here to offer my own small story of how I found my way to working with incarcerated writers, and the hope that it might serve as encouragement for others looking to do the same. When I started my journalism career nearly a decade ago at a small nonprofit outlet covering criminal justice in the courts, I began to notice that my more established colleagues, as they reported their stories on parole and juvenile sentencing, were receiving stacks of snail mail letters from residents in state prisons, many of whom asked for help getting the word out about injustices in their cases or in their conditions of incarceration. Eventually, as I settled in as a writer on the beat, I began to receive a few of these letters too. Academically and professionally, I had developed an interest in the injustices of American mass incarceration, but given the degree to which the system is segregated by race and class, I had little firsthand experience with prison. These stapled handwritten letters on lined paper made me think more than ever before about the experiences of the hundreds of thousands of people in American prisons, including many who had once lived in Chicago, where I lived at the time, and whose family members were my neighbors. The fact that their letters arrived by post, when the rest of our reporting business had long migrated to email and phone, only underscored how prisoners' perspectives had been siloed from everyday conversations. But despite my interest in these communications, it wasn't always clear to me how to incorporate them into our typical reporting work. If someone's story didn't fit into one of our investigative projects about a particular system policy, we didn't have much of a way to engage with it. Sometimes we connected with people to get a quick anecdote or quote for a lead of a story, and then moved on. Much of my own reporting then was centered on wrongful convictions, a particularly hot topic in the criminal justice media sphere at the time, which also meant that I didn't have much to offer the majority of prisoners who did commit the crime of which they had been convicted, but who were people experiencing the violence of incarceration all the same. The prisoner correspondence remained on my mind over the next few years. I eventually landed at Jewish Currents, a growing magazine of the Jewish left. Though it was no longer my primary beat, I was interested in expanding the magazine's coverage of the criminal legal system and incarceration as part of our broader commitment to leftist politics and social justice. Early in my tenure, as COVID-19 spread rapidly, I reported a story on how the virus was affecting incarcerated people across the country. I corresponded with 5 incarcerated men in 3 states across multiple glitchy email systems about the patchy public health measures and canceled programming they were witnessing. Perhaps it was this story that caught the attention of the early career incarcerated journalist Christopher Blackwell in Washington. Neither Chris, nor I, nor his partner Chelsea Moore, who sent me an email on his behalf, can remember now exactly what led him to reach out to Jewish Currents with a pitch. He says someone told him that Jewish Currents would pay $300 for a piece, which was true, though I'm confused about how word was going around about our tiny, new, relaunched operation of the Jewish left, which had never before published an incarcerated writer, in Washington state prisons at the time. And also, don't worry, we pay more now. But in any case, he found us, and I was excited to try to work together. I had tried to get on-the-ground perspectives of incarcerated people into my stories, but wouldn't it be even better to cut out the middlemen and just publish those perspectives directly? At the time, protests against George Floyd's murder were erupting across the country, and we assigned Chris to write about the experience of watching the uprising from prison. Chris, then with just a couple of clips to his name, says at the time it was still hard to fathom that an outlet would want to pay him money for his work, especially a sum that so outweighed the paltry amount he could earn at his prison job. I was so baffled that I could actually help my family from prison, he says. It was so mind-blowing that you guys cared. It makes people not feel ostracized. Over the next 2 years, we published pieces by Chris on how public health methods at his prison were being used as an excuse for solitary confinement, on the creative masks prisoners designed to express themselves, and on a Washington heat wave and the effects of climate change on prisons. I learned how to adapt my typical editing process for a writer who couldn't access Google Docs, rewriting my inline edits and comments as lists of questions to email to him over the JPay system. I stayed in touch with Chris via phone and JPay messaging as he got married to Chelsea in a small ceremony at the prison's visitors room, as he weathered a scary COVID outbreak in his unit, and as he eventually got his first piece published in the New York Times. We hosted a virtual panel on writing from prison, in which Chris, broadcast on Zoom via speakerphone, was able to speak to another incarcerated contributor in Pennsylvania. Our audience members listened to the automated messages when his time expired and he had to call back, giving a tangible demonstration of the challenges of inside-outside communication. 2 years into our prolific bi-coastal collaboration, Chris came to me with a new idea. He intended to start a writing workshop within the prison where he lives. He had already identified 4 guys who were excited about being trained in journalistic methods and submitting writing for publication, and he planned to be their mentor and coordinator. But to get started, they needed an editor willing to take a chance on these new writers and publish a collaboration with them to help them get experience and clips. Would Jewish Currents be willing to work on such a project? I was enthusiastic about Chris's new venture, but also a bit apprehensive about whether it was doable. What might it look like to bring 5 distinct perspectives together into one coherent story? How would it work to coordinate with 5 incarcerated writers at once? But Chris was determined to enact his new plan, which he hoped would serve as a model for mentorship programs across the country, and I didn't want to let him down. My colleagues and I decided that publishing a collaboration would work if we could find one central subject to hinge 5 pieces of writing on. Chris came back to us with an immediate answer: solitary confinement. He was already at work on a book about the subject, and he knew every one of the guys in his group had spent time in the hole, as it's often called, and experienced the psychological side effects of isolation. They could approach the experience from multiple angles, writing about what kinds of arbitrary infractions land you in solitary, what it actually feels like to spend time in isolation cells, and how the impacts of solitary carry on in the body even after the term of confinement is over. Chris had transmitted his work ethic and diligence to his mentees, and I'd barely assigned the story before 5 separate drafts had rolled into my JPay inbox, some of them split into multiple segments so that thousands of words could make it through the unforgiving, word count limited online system. They were filled with details of arbitrary prison discipline, invasive strip searches, dirty mattresses, never-ending bright lights, and blurred days of isolation. I knew it was no light thing to ask someone to write about a deeply traumatic experience, but many of the guys found a sense of healing in putting their experiences onto paper. Antoine Davis, a member of the group who is also a pastor and teacher in the prison, told me recently, "It was a bittersweet thing, because you have to relive that experience to communicate it effectively, but it was sweet in a sense of, hey, my voice is actually being given an opportunity to be heard," which is really very rare for those who have been behind bars for that long. Aaron Olson, who has served 20 years of a life sentence, told me, "Something happened once I started writing. The floodgates opened. Trauma has this strange relationship with language. Sometimes you survive by burying experiences so deeply that you stop fully accessing them, but once memory begins surfacing, it seems like all surfaces at once. Before I knew it, I had written over 7,000 words about my solitary confinement. The truth is, I had never written about it before. I was too afraid to, but unexpectedly, the process became somewhat therapeutic. Those are Aaron's words. In consultation with Chris, I cut down and rearranged the drafts so that they formed a timeline, chronologically narrating the solitary experience from the moment a prisoner is taken from their cell into isolation through to the long shadow of trauma after release. I wrote back to each writer with prompts for adding more description or reflection. Chris wrote an intro that put the pieces into the context of the history of solitary confinement in the United States. An incarcerated artist, also in Washington Correction Center, Hector Ortiz, mailed me drawings to go along with each moment of the story, which I scanned to use as illustrations. For Aaron, having an editor willing to work with him on his piece meant being treated like a human being, which, he said, changed something for me. When dealing with edits, we ended up talking, we refined it, we worked through multiple rounds, and slowly, this experience that I had carried privately for years transformed into journalism. And that distinction matters because journalism is not simply storytelling. Journalism says, this happened, it matters, and the public deserves to know. When the piece was published in spring 2023, it was immediately widely shared by our audience. We printed the piece and mailed it to the Washington Correction Center so that the writers themselves could read it. Later, we turned it into a zine. As I learned from the process and my follow-up conversations with the writers, working on a piece like In the Hole has an impact on multiple levels. Of course, there's a basic journalistic function. We need a first-hand correspondent to understand what happens in prisons, and the only people in a position to give that perspective are incarcerated writers. There's also, hopefully, a policy impact, as a political fight is being waged across the country to place legal limits on prisons' use of solitary confinement. Pieces like In the Hole can sway policymakers to recognize the violence inherent in such practices. But there's also a personal impact. The writers tell me that seeing their work published from inside prison helped them develop a sense of agency and capability and gave them hope for their own future. In a world in which, as Aaron reminded me, the system is designed to sever incarcerated people's pipelines to both economic and spiritual resources, this empowerment and consciousness development matters. For Chris, this kind of work has made him feel part of a broader community, one he's accountable to, one he's in relationship with. I didn't feel like I was part of our society until I was about 32 years old, he tells me. When we bring people in and listen to their voice, they feel like they belong. Then they snap out of survival mode. The year after publication, In the Hole was recognized as the winner of an Evident Change Media for a Just Society award. Each writer received a shiny glass award plaque, which I arranged to have sent to a friend or family member on their behalf. Aaron recalls, a year earlier, I was simply trying to survive prison psychologically while learning how to structure articles and pitch editors correctly, and suddenly I was being recognized nationally for investigative and justice-centered writing. Something changed internally after that. It was validation, not validation that I had suffered, I already knew that, but validation that my voice had value. This successful first publication quickly opened new doors for the members of Chris's mentorship group. Since then, they've collectively published more than 250 articles in outlets from The Nation to the Seattle Times to The Guardian. Antoine continued to develop his skills, writing about fatherhood in prison and other topics, and eventually took over as the lead mentor of a new cohort of the Writers Development Group. Now he's the one coming to me with pitches for group projects. Last year, Aaron solo bylined a big investigative piece on how Washington State discriminates against incarcerated immigrants, and he was recognized with a Stillwater Award. All of this followed from the decision to pursue one big story. Chris is very kind in giving me a lot of credit for my participation in this work, which is why I'm up here giving this speech. But the truth is, it didn't require any heroic amount of effort on my part or some unimaginable amount of resources. All I had to do was do my job, shape a pitch, review drafts, edit them in conversation with writers, and produce a final story. I say that because I want other editors to know that you can do this work too and have this kind of impact and be a part of this movement in journalism. It's not out of reach. Of course, that doesn't mean it's easy breezy. As we've learned over the past few days, the writers you work with can be targeted with retaliation and repression for their publications, and your audience may not embrace this work immediately. While luckily the work I've edited has always been positively received by our audience, I have seen examples elsewhere where writers flood the comments to complain about an incarcerated writer being allowed to write about any topic besides reflecting on their crime, or instances in which a writer's participation in a public publishing project is protested because of the nature of their conviction. Some readers think they're ready for conversations about decarceration, but turn out to only feel comfortable hearing about wrongful convictions or nonviolent offenses. People often find it comfortable to box away those who have committed harm to a separate category of humanity and think of violence as something only done by a different kind of person that we can recognize and isolate. But this is a fantasy. As Chris told me, when he encounters someone who says to him, "I don't really care about the experience of incarcerated writers or incarcerated people," he challenges them. Fine, but do you care about safety in your community? If we never hear from people inside, we can never address the mitigating factors that led them to get into a position to cause harm. How do we change any of this without learning about people and why they're in the situation they're in? I'll admit that I sometimes question whether this learning is enough. Up against so many material barriers, can words matter? Is anyone listening? Do enough people actually want to hear? I don't always have a great answer to these questions, but my conversations with Chris, Aaron, and Antoine about In the Hole remind me of the great stakes of this work. Despite the system's every effort, we are building a different model of community, in personal and political development, and what writing can mean and do in the world. I hope you'll join us. Thank you.